When Natalie Quinn walked across Auburn University's quad in her designer heels and Sigma Beta Chi letters, nobody suspected that beneath her perfectly styled blonde hair and sorority smile lay the mind of a combat veteran who had once coordinated helicopter evacuations under enemy fire. They saw what she wanted them to see. Just another privileged sorority girl more concerned with rush week than real-world responsibilities. But 3 years later, when a formation of Blackhawk helicopters descended onto that same quad and their crews stepped out to render the sharpest military salutes anyone had ever witnessed on campus, the truth would finally surface about who Natalie Quinn really was. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Natalie Quinn smoothed her lavender cashmere sweater as she walked through the mahogany doors of the Sigma Beta Chi sorority house on Magnolia Avenue. The morning sunlight filtered through the stained glass windows, casting colorful patterns across the marble foyer where her sorority sisters were already gathered for their weekly chapter meeting. At 22, Natalie had the kind of effortless beauty that made other girls simultaneously admire and resent her. Platinum blonde hair that never seemed out of place, emerald green eyes that sparkled with mischief, and a wardrobe that suggested unlimited parental funding. "Look who finally decided to grace us with her presence," called out Chloe Lancaster from across the room, her voice dripping with the kind of saccharine sweetness that barely concealed genuine irritation. Chloe, the sorority social chair, had been gunning for Natalie's position as recruitment director for months, and she never missed an opportunity to highlight what she saw as Natalie's shortcomings. Natalie slipped into the back row of white leather chairs, offering an apologetic smile to Emma Sullivan, the sorority president, who was already reviewing the day's agenda. "Sorry I'm late," she whispered, though she wasn't sorry at all. She'd been late because she'd spent the morning at the Auburn VA clinic volunteering with wounded veterans, a commitment none of her sorority sisters knew about. "Ladies," announced Emma, her voice echoing through the chapter room, "as you all know, Auburn's annual Military Appreciation Week begins Monday. The university has asked each Greek organization to contribute to the programming, and I think this is a perfect opportunity for Sigma Beta Chi to showcase our commitment to service." A collective groan rippled through the room. Military Appreciation Week was notorious among the Greek community for being poorly attended and frankly boring. Most sororities and fraternities treated their required participation as a box-checking exercise, sending their least enthusiastic members to stand at information booths or serve cookies at events that few people bothered to attend. "I was thinking we could host a Support Our Troops bake sale," suggested Zoe Witchell, the treasurer, already calculating the minimal effort required. "Maybe set up outside the library. It's practically foolproof." Chloe Lancaster raised her perfectly manicured hand. "Or we could do one of those care package assembly events, have everyone bring toiletries and snacks, take some cute photos for Instagram, and call it a day. The military families eat that stuff up." Natalie felt her jaw tighten imperceptibly. These girls had no idea what military families actually needed, no understanding of what it meant to serve, and certainly no appreciation for the sacrifices made by the men and women in uniform. They saw Military Appreciation Week as an inconvenience, something to be endured rather than embraced. "Actually," Natalie said quietly, standing up from her chair. The room fell silent. Natalie rarely spoke up during chapter meetings, preferring to blend into the background and avoid drawing her attention to herself. Her sisters turned to look at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to mild surprise. "What did you have in mind?" Emma asked, genuinely interested. Natalie was one of their most reliable members when it came to event planning, though she typically worked behind the scenes rather than taking center stage. Natalie walked to the front of the room, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor. "I think we should partner with Fort Rucker for a comprehensive support event, not just a bake sale or care packages, but something that actually honors the service and sacrifice of our military personnel." Chloe snorted. "Fort Rucker, Natalie? That's like an hour away. And what do we know about working with actual military people? This is supposed to be a simple community service project, not a major production." Besides, added Samantha Brooks, the vice president, what kind of event could we possibly organize that would be meaningful to military personnel? We're college students, not defense contractors. Natalie felt the familiar frustration bubbling up inside her, the same feeling she'd experienced countless times over the past 3 years when people underestimated her capabilities based on her appearance or assumed background. They saw a sorority girl from a wealthy family, someone who'd probably never experienced hardship or challenge beyond choosing which designer bag to carry. If only they knew the truth. I was thinking we could coordinate with the helicopter training squadrons at Fort Rucker, Natalie continued, her voice steady despite the skeptical looks from her sisters. Maybe arrange for some of their pilots to visit campus, share their experiences, and give students a chance to learn about military aviation. We could also organize care packages specifically tailored to the needs of aviators, items that would actually be useful rather than just symbolic. The room erupted in murmurs and whispered conversations. Several sisters exchanged glances that clearly communicated their shared opinion. Natalie had finally lost her mind. Helicopter pilots? Chloe laughed outright. Natalie, honey, I think you've been watching too many movies. How exactly do you propose we contact military helicopter pilots? Do you think they're just sitting around waiting for sorority girls to call them up? And what makes you know what aviators need? Have you suddenly become an expert on military life while the rest of us weren't paying attention? Natalie stood at the front of the room, surrounded by the questioning stares of 23 young women who had no idea they were looking at someone who had spent 2 years coordinating helicopter support missions in Afghanistan, someone who had earned the respect of some of the finest pilots in the United States Army, someone who could plan and execute complex logistics operations that these girls couldn't even imagine. But Natalie Quinn had worked too hard to build her cover to blow it now over a sorority project dispute. I just think we should aim higher than bake sales, she said diplomatically, returning to her seat. But if the chapter prefers a simpler approach, I'm happy to support whatever decision you make. Emma nodded approvingly. I appreciate your enthusiasm, Natalie, but Chloe has a point. We need to be realistic about our capabilities and resources. Let's stick with the care package assembly event. It's proven, manageable, and still shows our support for the military. As the meeting continued with discussions about ribbon colors and publicity strategies, Natalie stared out the window toward the quad where students were hurrying between classes, completely unaware that one of the most decorated logistics specialists in recent Army history was sitting in a sorority meeting pretending to care about color-coordinated care package ribbons. The irony wasn't lost on her. 3 years ago, she had been coordinating helicopter evacuations under enemy fire, managing complex supply chains that kept forward operating bases functioning, and earning commendations for her service in one of the most dangerous regions in the world. Now she was being lectured about the impossibility of contacting military pilots by girls who thought Military Appreciation Week was an inconvenience. But Natalie had her reasons for maintaining this elaborate masquerade, reasons that went deeper than anyone in that room could ever understand. And as she sat through the remainder of the meeting, nodding along with discussions about bake sale logistics and Instagram photo opportunities, Natalie couldn't help but wonder how her sorority sisters would react if they knew the truth about who she really was. The meeting ended with assignments distributed and responsibilities allocated. Natalie volunteered to handle supply procurement for the care package event, a role that would keep her busy but relatively invisible. As her sisters filed out of the chapter room, chattering about weekend plans and upcoming social events, Chloe approached her with a patronizing smile. Natalie, I hope you don't take this the wrong way, but your helicopter pilot idea was a little ambitious. I know you mean well, but sometimes it's better to stick with what we know we can handle. Leave the military stuff to people who actually understand it. Natalie smiled back, the kind of perfect sorority sister smile she had perfected over the past 3 years. You're absolutely right, Chloe. Thanks for keeping me grounded.
As Chloe walked away, satisfied with her perceived victory, she had no idea that the woman she had just condescended to was already formulating a plan that would not only make Military Appreciation Week unforgettable, but would also reveal the truth about Natalie Quinn in the most spectacular way possible. Because sometimes the best way to honor the military is to remind people that heroes come in all forms, even ones wearing designer sweaters and sorority letters.
That afternoon, Natalie drove her silver BMW convertible off campus and down Highway 29 toward Fort Rucker, Alabama. The 40-minute drive through rolling hills and pine forests gave her time to shed the carefully constructed persona she maintained at Auburn University. With each mile that passed, the sorority girl facade melted away, replaced by the focused determination of someone who had once managed life-and-death logistics operations in combat zones. Fort Rucker, known as the home of Army aviation, sprawled across 63,000 acres of Alabama countryside. As Natalie approached the main gate, she felt the familiar mixture of pride and melancholy that always accompanied her returns to military installations. The crisp salutes from the military police, the sound of helicopter rotors in the distance, and the sight of soldiers in uniform. It all reminded her of a life she'd left behind but never truly abandoned. "Ma'am, may I see your identification and visitor pass?" asked Staff Sergeant Tyler Brooks, the gate guard who had come to recognize Natalie's regular visits over the past 6 months. "Of course, Sergeant," Natalie replied, handing over her Auburn University staff ID and her volunteer credentials for the base's Family Readiness Group Support Program. What the gate guard didn't know was that Natalie also possessed a common access card with security clearances that would have surprised him, credentials she kept carefully hidden in a locked box in her apartment. The drive through Fort Rucker took her past the familiar sights of military life. Newly minted warrant officers learning to fly Blackhawk helicopters, seasoned pilots practicing advanced maneuvers, and maintenance crews working with precision that could mean the difference between mission success and catastrophe. For most civilians, this would have been an alien world. For Natalie, it felt like coming home. She parked outside Building 4507, headquarters of the 1st Aviation Regiment, where she had an appointment with Chief Warrant Officer Hannah Cross. Hannah was one of the few people at Fort Rucker who knew the truth about Natalie's background, and their weekly meetings served multiple purposes. Officially, they coordinated volunteer activities for military families, but unofficially, they provided Natalie with a connection to the world she'd left behind. "Quinn," Hannah called out as Natalie entered the headquarters building. "Good to see you. How's college life treating you?" Hannah Cross was everything Natalie appeared not to be: tough, direct, and unapologetically military in her bearing. At 34, she had logged over 3,000 flight hours in Blackhawk helicopters and had earned her reputation as one of the finest pilots in aviation. She also happened to be one of the few people who understood why Natalie had chosen to hide her military background while pursuing her degree. "Can't complain," Natalie replied, following Hannah into her office, "though I have to admit, sorority meetings are a far cry from mission briefings." Hannah laughed. "I still can't believe you're pulling off this whole sorority princess act. When I first met you 3 years ago, I never would have imagined you'd be able to blend in with a bunch of college kids who think the biggest crisis in life is running out of pumpkin spice lattes." Natalie settled into the chair across from Hannah's desk, surrounded by military aviation memorabilia and photographs from various deployments. "It's harder than I expected," she admitted. "Sometimes I want to grab them and explain how the real world works, but then I remember why I'm doing this." The truth was complicated, as it is with stories that matter. Natalie Quinn hadn't started out as a sorority girl at Auburn University. She'd started out as Specialist Natalie Quinn, a logistics coordinator with the 101 1st Airborne Division, who had deployed to Afghanistan at the age of 19. Over 2 years in combat zones, she'd earned a reputation as someone who could make impossible things happen, getting supplies to remote outposts, coordinating helicopter support for troops under fire, and managing complex operations that required split-second decision-making under extreme pressure. Her specialty had been helicopter logistics coordination. While other soldiers focused on ground operations, Natalie had become an expert in managing helicopter support missions, understanding aircraft capabilities, coordinating with pilots, planning landing zones, and calculating weight and balance requirements for everything from routine supply runs to emergency evacuations. She'd been good at it,
exceptionally good. So good that she'd been handpicked for assignment to a classified Joint Operations Task Force that coordinated helicopter support for special operations missions throughout Afghanistan and Pakistan. For 18 months, she'd worked alongside some of the most elite pilots and aircrew in the military, earning their respect and trust through competence and reliability under pressure. You know, Hannah said, leaning back in her chair, Captain Dylan Foster was asking about you again yesterday. Dylan Foster was the commanding officer of Alpha Company 1st Battalion 145th Aviation Regiment, one of Fort Rucker's Blackhawk training units. He was also someone who had served alongside Natalie during her final deployment back when she was still wearing the uniform instead of designer clothes.
"What did you tell him?" Natalie asked. "Same thing I always tell him, that you're doing well and focusing on your studies. He still thinks you're making a mistake, you know? He's convinced you could be running helicopter operations for an entire division by now if you'd stayed in." Natalie stared out the window at a formation of Blackhawk helicopters conducting training flights. The sight of the aircraft brought back a flood of memories. Pre-dawn mission briefings, the controlled chaos of loading helicopters under fire, and the quiet satisfaction of successful operations that had saved lives and completed objectives. "Maybe he's right," she said quietly, "but I made a promise." The promise had been made in a hospital room at Walter Reed Medical Center 3 years earlier, to her younger brother, Jake. He'd been 20 years old, a Marine Lance Corporal serving his first deployment in Afghanistan when an improvised explosive device had changed everything. The blast had taken his left leg below the knee and filled his right leg with shrapnel that would require years of surgery and rehabilitation. Jake Quinn had been following in his big sister's footsteps, inspired by her stories of military service and her rapid advancement through the ranks. When he'd been wounded, Natalie had been consumed by guilt. Guilt that she'd inspired him to enlist, guilt that she hadn't been there to protect him, and guilt that her expertise in helicopter operations hadn't been enough to prevent the attack that had changed his life forever. In that hospital room, watching her little brother struggle with the reality of his injuries, Natalie had made a decision that would have surprised everyone who knew her military reputation. She decided to leave the Army and pursue a completely different life, one that would honor Jake's sacrifice while avoiding the kind of service that might inspire another family member to follow a dangerous path. The plan had been straightforward in theory: complete her degree using her GI Bill benefits, maintain a low profile, and transition into civilian life without drawing attention to her military background. Auburn University had seemed like the perfect place to disappear. A large enough student body to blend in, far enough from major military installations to avoid casual recognition, and academically rigorous enough to provide the challenge she craved. Joining Sigma Beta Chi sorority had been a calculated decision. Greek life provided instant social connections and a ready-made identity that would help her fit in with traditional college students. More importantly, it provided cover. Nobody would suspect that a sorority girl who spent her weekends at social events and philanthropy activities had once coordinated helicopter operations in combat zones. "Your brother's doing well, isn't he?" Hannah asked, pulling Natalie back to the present. "Better than well. He just finished his degree in engineering and landed a job with a defense contractor. He's designing prosthetics for wounded veterans." Natalie smiled. "He says he's found a way to serve without carrying a rifle." "Sounds familiar. Though I'd argue that what you're doing here, the volunteer work with military families, the support for our junior officers, that's still serving, even if you're not wearing the uniform." Natalie's volunteer work at Fort Rucker was extensive and largely invisible. She helped military spouses navigate healthcare bureaucracy, organize support groups for families dealing with deployment stress, and provided informal mentoring for junior officers who were struggling with the transition from military academy to active duty. Her background in logistics and operations made her uniquely qualified to help solve problems that seemed insurmountable to others. "Speaking of serving," Hannah continued, "I heard Auburn University is planning some kind of military appreciation week event. Any chance your sorority might get involved?" Natalie grimaced. "They're planning a care package assembly event. The
the kind where everyone brings random toiletries and snacks, takes photos for social media, and considers their duty complete. Ouch. I take it you had different ideas. I suggested partnering with Fort Rucker for something more substantial. Maybe bringing some pilots to campus to share their experiences, or organizing an event that would actually educate students about military aviation. You can imagine how well that went over. Hannah leaned forward, her expression shifting from casual conversation to serious military planning mode. You know, that's actually not a bad idea. We've been looking for ways to improve our community outreach, especially with college students. Most of them have no idea what modern military aviation involves or how it contributes to national security. Hannah, I can't. Hear me out, Hannah interrupted. What if I told you that Captain Foster has been working on a community outreach initiative that could use exactly the kind of university partnership you're describing? And what if I mentioned that he's specifically been looking for someone with your background to help coordinate it? Natalie felt her pulse quicken. The possibility of combining her hitting expertise with her current situation was both thrilling and terrifying. For 3 years, she had maintained strict separation between her military past and her civilian present. The idea of bringing those worlds together felt like walking across a minefield. It would have to be subtle, she said slowly. I can't blow my cover, and I definitely can't let my sorority sisters know about my background, at least not yet. Understood, but think about it. This could be your chance to create something meaningful instead of watching them assemble random care packages. And who knows? Maybe it's time for some of those Auburn students to learn that heroes come in all forms. As Natalie drove back to campus that evening, she found herself considering possibilities she never imagined. Could she really coordinate a meaningful Military Appreciation Week event without revealing her true identity? Could she bring Fort Rucker pilots to Auburn University without exposing her own background? And most importantly, was she ready to risk the carefully constructed life she'd built to honor the service of people who deserve better than care package assembly events? The answer, she realized, was probably yes. But first, she'd have to convince her sorority sisters that their naive recruitment director somehow had the connections and expertise to pull off the impossible.
Monday morning found Natalie standing outside Emma Sullivan's corner office in the Sigma Beta Chi house, holding a manila folder that contained what could either be the most brilliant plan she'd ever conceived or the end of her carefully maintained cover story. Through the frosted glass door, she could hear Emma on the phone with someone from the university's Greek life office, discussing liability insurance for upcoming social events. "Come in," Emma called after Natalie knocked. "Oh, hey, Natalie. What can I do for you?" Emma Sullivan was everything a sorority president should be: organized, diplomatic, and possessed of the kind of natural leadership that made people want to follow her direction. At 21, she'd already been accepted to law school and had spent her junior year studying abroad at Oxford. She was also one of the few sisters who had ever shown genuine interest in Natalie's opinions, which made what Natalie was about to propose both easier and more terrifying. "I wanted to follow up on our discussion about Military Appreciation Week," Natalie began, settling into the chair across from Emma's mahogany desk. The office was decorated with photographs from sorority events, academic awards, and a collection of law books that Emma had been accumulating in preparation for her post-graduation plans. "Sure," Emma said, though her expression suggested she was expecting another pitch for the helicopter pilot idea that had been so thoroughly dismissed during the chapter meeting. "I thought we'd already decided on the care package event. Chloe's already started organizing supplies, and frankly, it's exactly the kind of manageable project we need right now." Natalie opened her folder and spread several documents across Emma's desk. "I know, and I think the care package idea has merit, but what if I told you we could do both? What if we could organize the care packages as part of a larger event that would not only honor military personnel, but also put Sigma Beta Chi at the center of the most successful Military Appreciation Week in Auburn University's history?" Emma leaned forward, studying the papers Natalie had arranged.
The documents included detailed event proposals, budget estimates, and what appeared to be official correspondence on Fort Rucker letterhead. Natalie, where did you get all this? I've been doing some research, Natalie replied carefully. It turns out that Fort Rucker has been looking for opportunities to engage with university students, and Auburn's Military Appreciation Week could be the perfect partnership opportunity. What Natalie didn't mention was that she'd spent the weekend working with Hannah Cross and Captain Foster to develop a comprehensive proposal that would benefit both institutions while maintaining her cover. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Sigma Beta Chi would serve as the primary university liaison for a joint Auburn-Fort Rucker Military Appreciation Week, featuring educational presentations, aircraft displays, and meaningful community engagement. Look at this, Natalie continued, pointing to a detailed schedule. Monday through Wednesday, we host information sessions where military personnel share their experiences with students. Thursday, we have a helicopter display on the quad, actual Blackhawk helicopters that students can tour and learn about. Friday, we conclude with a formal ceremony honoring local veterans and active duty personnel. Emma studied the proposal with the careful attention she typically reserved for constitutional law assignments. This is incredibly detailed, Natalie. How did you possibly put together something this comprehensive over one weekend? Natalie felt her heart racing. This was the moment where her cover story would either hold or collapse entirely. I have a cousin who works in military logistics, she lied smoothly. When I told her about our Military Appreciation Week discussion, she offered to help me research possibilities. It turns out there are existing programs designed to facilitate exactly this kind of university-military partnership. The lie came easier than Natalie had expected, probably because it contained enough truth to feel authentic. She did have extensive experience with military logistics, even if she wasn't sharing the real source of that expertise. And Fort Rucker is actually interested in participating? Asked Emma. More than interested. They're enthusiastic. Natalie pointed to what appeared to be an official letter from Captain Foster's office. They see this as an opportunity to educate university students about the realities of military service and the role of Army aviation in national defense. Plus, it helps them fulfill their community outreach requirements. Emma continued reading through the proposal, her expression shifting from skepticism to genuine interest. Natalie, this is impressive work, really impressive. But I have to ask, how do we know we can actually execute something this ambitious? This isn't assembling care packages in the chapter room. This is coordinating with active military units, managing aircraft displays, and organizing formal ceremonies. Do we have the expertise to handle something like this?
Natalie took a deep breath. This was the crucial moment, the point where she would either have to reveal more of her background than she was comfortable with, or find a way to convince Emma that Sigma Beta Chi could handle the complexity without admitting her own role in developing the plan. I've been thinking about that, Natalie said carefully. What if I took point on the military coordination aspects? I've been researching this extensively, and I feel confident I could serve as the primary liaison with Fort Rucker. The rest of the chapter could focus on the university side logistics. Publicity, venue coordination, student outreach. We'd be playing to everyone's strengths. You're volunteering to coordinate with active military units? Emma asked, raising an eyebrow. Natalie, no offense, but that seems like a pretty significant responsibility for someone who's never worked with military personnel before. If only you knew, Natalie thought. Out loud, she said, I know it sounds ambitious, but I've been studying their protocols and requirements. Plus, they've offered to provide guidance and support throughout the planning process. It's not like I'd be operating in a vacuum. Emma leaned back in her chair, clearly wrestling with the decision. On one hand, the proposal was exactly the kind of high-profile, meaningful project that could enhance Sigma Beta Chi's reputation on campus and distinguish them from other Greek organizations. On the other hand, it represented a significant departure from their typical approach to community service events. What about Chloe? She's already invested time and energy in the care package plan, and she's not going to be thrilled about scrapping it for something this elaborate. We're not scrapping it. The care package assembly becomes part of the larger event.
Instead of random toiletries and snacks, we work with Fort Rucker to identify specific items that would be most useful to deployed personnel. The care packages become meaningful contributions rather than symbolic gestures. Emma studied Natalie with new interest. Over the 2 years they had served together in Sigma Beta Chi leadership, she'd come to respect Natalie's quiet competence and attention to detail. But this level of strategic thinking and project management was something she'd never seen from her before. Natalie, I have to ask, where is this coming from? Don't get me wrong, I'm impressed, but this is a side of you I haven't seen before. You're usually more behind the scenes, and suddenly you're proposing to coordinate with military helicopter units? Natalie felt the familiar tension of maintaining her cover story while trying to demonstrate enough competence to be trusted with the project. I guess I've been inspired by the research I've been doing, learning about what military personnel actually do, the sacrifices they make, the skills they develop. It's made me want to do something more meaningful than the typical college approach to military appreciation. It was true if it wasn't the whole truth. Working with wounded veterans at the VA clinic, maintaining her connections at Fort Rucker, and watching her brother rebuild his life after his injury had reinforced her appreciation for military service, even as she had chosen a different path for herself. Emma gathered the proposal documents and stacked them neatly. I'm going to need to present this to the executive board before making a decision. But Natalie, I want you to know that I'm genuinely impressed. This is exactly the kind of innovative thinking that could set us apart from every other sorority on campus. What do you think the board's concerns will be? Liability, complexity, and Chloe, Emma said with a slight smile. But if you can address the first two, I'll handle the third. Can you put together a risk management plan and a detailed timeline showing how we'd handle the logistics? Absolutely, Natalie replied, although she knew that creating those documents would require another consultation with her contacts at Fort Rucker. When would you need them? Wednesday morning. I want to present the full proposal to the board Wednesday afternoon, which gives us time to refine anything that needs work. As Natalie left Emma's office, she realized she had just committed herself to a course of action that would require increasingly elaborate coordination between her civilian and military worlds. She was going to have to work more closely with Hannah Cross and Captain Foster, which meant more visits to Fort Rucker and more opportunities for someone to recognize her. But as she walked through the sorority house, passing photographs of previous generations of Sigma Beta Chi sisters who had contributed to their community in various ways, Natalie felt a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since leaving the military. Maybe it was time to stop hiding from who she really was. Maybe it was time to show Auburn University what real military appreciation looked like. The question was whether she could pull it off without revealing the truth about specialist Natalie Quinn, who once coordinated helicopter operations that saved lives in Afghanistan, and who was now disguised as a sorority girl planning the most ambitious Military Appreciation Week event in university history. Wednesday afternoon arrived with the kind of oppressive Alabama humidity that made even the air-conditioned Sigma Beta Chi chapter room feel stifling. Natalie sat in the back row, her perfectly prepared risk management plan and logistics timeline folder resting on her lap, while Emma Sullivan called the executive board meeting to order. Around the mahogany conference table sat the 5 most influential members of the sorority. Emma is president, Samantha Brooks as vice president, Zoe Mitchell as treasurer, Chloe Lancaster as social chair, and Victoria Hamilton as standards chair. Ladies, Emma began, distributing copies of Natalie's proposal, I've asked you here to consider a significant departure from our original Military Appreciation Week plan. Natalie has developed a comprehensive partnership proposal with Fort Rucker that could transform not just our event, but Auburn's entire approach to honoring military personnel. Chloe Lancaster's perfectly manicured fingers drummed against the table as she flipped through the documents. Emma, with all due respect, this is exactly the kind of overreach I was worried about when Natalie first brought up her helicopter fantasy. We're a sorority, not a military planning committee. It's not a fantasy, Natalie interjected quietly. Fort Rucker has confirmed their interest in participating. This is a real opportunity to create something meaningful. Meaningful for whom? Chloe shot back. Natalie, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but you're proposing that we coordinate aircraft displays, manage visiting military personnel, and organize formal ceremonies. Do you have any idea what kind of liability exposure that creates? What happens if someone gets hurt during a helicopter demonstration? What if military personnel behave inappropriately around our members? What if we promise something we can't deliver and embarrass the entire university? Samantha Brooks nodded in agreement. Chloe raises valid concerns. Our insurance probably doesn't cover military aircraft demonstrations, and I can't imagine the university would approve something this elaborate without months of advanced planning. Natalie felt the familiar frustration building inside her. These were exactly the kinds of risk-averse, small-thinking objections that had driven her crazy during corporate planning meetings in the civilian world. In the military, when an opportunity presented itself to accomplish the mission more effectively, you adapted and executed. In sorority politics, apparently, you found reasons why innovation was too dangerous. Actually, Natalie said, standing and moving to the front of the room, I've addressed all of those concerns in the risk management plan. She opened her folder and began distributing additional documents. Fort Rucker carries comprehensive liability insurance for all public demonstrations. The aircraft displays would be conducted by certified military personnel following established safety protocols. And I've already spoken with the university's event planning office. They're enthusiastic about the partnership and willing to expedite the approval process. Victoria Hamilton, who had been quietly reading through the proposal, looked up with surprise. Natalie, when did you speak with the university event planning office? And how did you get detailed information about Fort Rucker's insurance coverage? Natalie felt her pulse quicken. She'd made those calls using contacts Hannah Cross had provided, but explaining that would require revealing far more about her background than she was prepared to share. I've been doing extensive research, she replied carefully. When you're proposing something this significant, you have to be thorough. Thorough is one thing, Chloe said, her voice taking on a sharper edge. But you're talking like you have inside knowledge of military protocols and university bureaucracy. Natalie, what aren't you telling us? The room fell silent. 5 pairs of eyes focused on Natalie with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. She realized she'd reached a critical decision point, either reveal enough of her background to establish credibility, or watch her proposal die under the weight of unanswered questions. My family has military connections, Natalie said slowly, choosing her words with extreme care. I've learned more about how these institutions work than most college students would know. But that doesn't change the fact that this is a legitimate opportunity to create something special. Family connections? Zoe Mitchell leaned forward. Natalie, in 2 years of sorority membership, you've never mentioned having family in the military. Are we supposed to believe you've been hiding military relatives this entire time? Natalie felt the walls closing in. She'd worked so hard to maintain her cover, to blend seamlessly into the world of college social life, that she'd perhaps been too successful. Her sorority sisters saw her as someone who had appeared out of nowhere with no backstory, no apparent depth, and no connections to anything more serious than rush week planning. People don't always share everything about their families, Natalie replied, though she could hear the defensive note creeping into her voice. I've always been private about personal matters.
Emma Sullivan, who had been watching the exchange with growing concern, held up her hand. Ladies, let's focus on the proposal itself rather than Natalie's qualifications to present it. The question isn't whether Natalie has hidden depths we weren't aware of. Clearly she does. The question is whether this partnership serves our chapter's interests and Auburn's military appreciation goals. But that's exactly the problem, Chloe insisted. How can we evaluate whether this serves our interests when we don't understand how Natalie developed the expertise to propose it? For all we know, she's gotten us involved in something we can't handle, with consequences we can't predict. Samantha Brooks pulled out her phone and began scrolling through what appeared to be social media profiles. You know what's interesting? I've been looking at Natalie's online presence, and it's remarkably sparse for someone our age. No military family photos, no posts about supporting troops, no indication of any connection to Fort Rucker or military aviation. It's almost like she's deliberately avoided mentioning anything military-related until this week. Natalie felt her carefully constructed world beginning to unravel. 3 years of maintaining perfect operational security, 3 years of building a completely civilian identity,
And now her own sorority sisters were conducting the kind of background investigation that could expose everything. Social media doesn't reflect everything about someone's life, Natalie said, though she knew how weak that sounded. I prefer to keep family matters private. Private or secret? Chloe asked pointedly, because there's a difference between being private about family connections and completely concealing relevant background that affects your credibility in proposing major sorority initiatives. Victoria Hamilton closed her copy of the proposal and looked directly at Natalie. Here's what I don't understand. If you have these extensive military connections and this deep knowledge of how military institutions work, why did you join a sorority known for social events and philanthropy rather than something like the Veteran Student Association or ROTC? Why spend 2 years planning rush events and charity fundraisers when you apparently had the background to be involved in much more substantial military-related activities? The question hit closer to home than Victoria could possibly know. Natalie had chosen Sigma Beta Chi precisely because it was as far from military life as possible, because it provided cover for someone trying to disappear from her previous identity. But explaining that would require admitting that she was hiding from something, which would only generate more questions she couldn't answer honestly. Maybe I wanted a normal college experience. Maybe I was tired of everything revolving around military service and wanted to be part of something different. Tired of military service? Chloe pounced on the phrase. That's an interesting way to put it. Almost like you're speaking from personal experience rather than family observation. Natalie realized she'd made a critical error. Her language had shifted from someone talking about relatives to someone talking about personal experience, and Chloe had caught it immediately. Emma Sullivan, sensing the interrogation was spiraling beyond productive discussion, called for order. Ladies, I think we're getting sidetracked. Natalie has presented a detailed, well-researched proposal that could significantly enhance our Military Appreciation Week programming. The question before us is whether we want to pursue this opportunity or stick with our original care package plan. The question before us, Chloe corrected, is whether we can trust someone who clearly hasn't been honest about her background to lead us into a complex partnership with military institutions. How do we know she's capable of managing the coordination she's proposing? How do we know she won't get us in over our heads with commitments we can't fulfill? Zoe Mitchell nodded in agreement. I hate to say it, but Chloe has a point. This proposal requires a level of military liaison work that none of us have experience with. If Natalie does have that experience, she needs to be transparent about it. If she doesn't, then we're taking a huge risk based on research and family connections that may not be sufficient. Natalie stood at the front of the room, facing 5 women who had gone from skeptical to suspicious to openly challenging her credibility. She could feel everything she'd worked to build over the past 3 years hanging in the balance. Her cover story was crumbling, her sorority membership was in jeopardy, and her proposal, which could have honored military service in a meaningful way, was dying under the weight of questions she couldn't answer honestly. But as she looked at their faces, Natalie realized something important. They weren't wrong to be suspicious. They weren't wrong to demand transparency from someone proposing to represent their organization in high-stakes coordination with military institutions. And maybe, just maybe, they deserved better than the carefully constructed lies she'd been telling them for 2 years. The question was whether she was ready to tell them the truth about who she really was.
Natalie stood at the front of the chapter room, 5 pairs of eyes trained on her with expressions ranging from suspicion to outright hostility. The silence stretched uncomfortably as she wrestled with a decision that would change everything. Continue the elaborate deception that had defined her college experience, or trust these women with a truth that could destroy the carefully constructed life she'd spent 3 years building. You want to know about my military background? Natalie asked quietly, her voice carrying a new tone that none of her sorority sisters had heard before. You want to know why I understand Fort Rucker protocols and university coordination requirements? Emma Sullivan leaned forward. Natalie, you don't have to. Yes, I do. Natalie interrupted, her decision crystallizing with sudden clarity. You're right to question my credibility. You're right to demand transparency. And you're right to be suspicious of someone who claims family connections but speaks from personal experience. She walked to her purse and pulled out her wallet, extracting a small laminated card that she'd kept hidden for 3 years. With steady hands, she placed her military common access card on the conference table where all 5 board members could see it. My name is Natalie Quinn, but for 2 years, I was Specialist Natalie Quinn, United States Army 101st Airborne Division. I didn't learn about helicopter operations from family connections. I learned about them by coordinating helicopter support missions in Afghanistan and Pakistan. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and whispered conversations. Chloe Lancaster stared at the military identification card as if it might be a forgery, while Samantha Brooks pulled out her phone to research military ranks and units. I was a logistics coordination specialist. My job was to manage helicopter support for ground operations, coordinating with pilots, planning landing zones, calculating load requirements, and ensuring that supplies and personnel got where they needed to go under combat conditions. Victoria Hamilton picked up the CAC card and examined it closely. This says you had a secret security clearance. Natalie, what exactly were you doing over there? Keeping people alive. Natalie replied simply. For 18 months, I was assigned to a joint operations task force that provided helicopter support for special operations missions. We coordinated everything from routine supply runs to emergency evacuations under fire. When ground units needed helicopter support, they called us. When helicopter crews needed intelligence about landing zones and threat assessments, they called us. When missions went wrong and people needed to be extracted quickly, they called us. Zoe Mitchell was frantically taking notes as if she were trying to fact-check Natalie's claims in real time. But why keep this secret? Why join a sorority and pretend to be just another college student when you're a combat veteran? Natalie's expression darkened. Because my little brother Jake followed me into the military. He was 20 years old, a Marine Lance Corporal on his first deployment, when an IED took his left leg and filled his right leg with shrapnel. He enlisted because he wanted to be like his big sister, the logistics specialist who was making a difference in Afghanistan. The chapter room fell silent again, but this time the silence carried weight and understanding rather than suspicion. Jake spent 8 months in Walter Reed Medical Center, 8 months of surgeries, physical therapy, and learning to walk again. And the whole time I kept thinking about how my stories of military service had inspired him to enlist. I kept wondering if my example had cost him his leg. Emma Sullivan's expression had shifted from suspicion to sympathy. Natalie, that wasn't your fault. Maybe not. But in that hospital room, watching my brother struggle with phantom pain and prosthetic fittings, I made a promise. I promised him that I would finish my degree, transition to civilian life, and never again inspire another family member to choose military service. I joined Sigma Beta Chi because I wanted to disappear into normal college life. I wanted to be as far from military culture as possible. But you kept your clearance, Victoria observed, still examining the CAC card. And you've been volunteering at Fort Rucker. That doesn't sound like someone trying to distance herself from military life. Natalie smiled sadly. You can't just turn off 3 years of training and experience. I volunteer with military families because I understand what they're going through. I maintain my connections at Fort Rucker because those relationships matter. But I've been trying to serve without putting on the uniform again, without encouraging others to follow a path that could cost them what it cost Jake.
Chloe Lancaster had been unusually quiet during Natalie's revelation, but now she leaned forward with a complex expression. So when you proposed the Fort Rucker partnership, you weren't just some sorority girl with ambitious ideas. You were a military professional who knew exactly what she was talking about. Yes, Natalie admitted, but I was also someone trying to honor military service without revealing my own background. I thought I could coordinate a meaningful Military Appreciation Week event while maintaining my cover. I thought I could serve without being seen to serve. Samantha Brooks looked up from her phone, where she'd apparently been researching the 101st Airborne Division. Natalie, the 101st is one of the most elite units in the Army. And you said you worked with special operations? That's not exactly routine military service. No, it wasn't routine, Natalie agreed, which is why I've been so careful to keep it hidden. Most people don't understand what military service actually involves, especially combat deployments. It's easier to let people think you're just another college student than to explain helicopter coordination under fire or casualty evacuation procedures. Emma Sullivan gathered the scattered proposal documents and Natalie's military identification. This changes everything, doesn't it? Not just about the Military Appreciation Week event, but about who you are and what you're capable of. Does it? Natalie asked. Because I'm still the same person who's been serving as recruitment director for 2 years. I'm still the same person who's helped plan charity events and managed Rush Week logistics. The only difference is now you know why I'm competent at planning and coordination. Victoria Hamilton shook her head. Natalie, you're not just competent. You're professionally qualified to coordinate military partnerships at a level that most universities could never achieve. The question isn't whether we should approve your proposal. The question is whether we deserve to have someone with your expertise representing our sorority. Zoe Mitchell closed her notebook and looked directly at Natalie. I owe you an apology. We all do. We questioned your credibility when we should have been questioning our own assumptions about who you are and what you're capable of. You don't owe me anything, Natalie replied. You were right to be suspicious. I've been lying to you for 2 years about fundamental aspects of my identity. You were right to demand transparency before trusting me with a major sorority initiative. Chloe Lancaster stood up and walked to where Natalie was standing. For a moment, the two women faced each other in silence. The social chair who had opposed the proposal from the beginning, and the combat veteran who had been hiding in plain sight for 3 years. Natalie, Chloe said finally, I've been giving you grief about this helicopter idea because I thought you were naive and inexperienced. But you're not naive, are you? You're probably the most experienced person in this room when it comes to understanding what military appreciation actually means. Experience doesn't automatically make someone right, Natalie replied diplomatically. No, but it does make someone qualified, Emma interjected. Natalie, the board needs to vote on your proposal, but first I need to ask you something directly. If we approve this partnership with Fort Rucker, are you prepared to serve as our liaison with full transparency about your background? Are you ready to stop hiding who you are? Natalie looked around the room at 5 women who had gone from suspicious strangers to potential allies in the space of 20 minutes. For 3 years, she had been terrified that revealing her military background would destroy the civilian life she had built. But standing in this chapter room, surrounded by people who now knew the truth, she realized that hiding had been more exhausting than serving had ever been. Yes, she said simply, I'm ready to stop hiding. I'm ready to serve openly, even if it means inspiring others to consider military service. Maybe it's time to trust that people can make their own informed decisions about how they want to serve their country. Emma Sullivan called for a formal vote. All in favor of approving Natalie's Military Appreciation Week proposal and authorizing her to serve as our Fort Rucker liaison. 5 hands went up simultaneously. Motion carries unanimously, Emma announced. Natalie, congratulations! You just became the most qualified military liaison in Auburn University's Greek system. As the board members began discussing implementation timelines and publicity strategies, Natalie felt a weight lifting from her shoulders that she hadn't even realized she had been carrying. For the first time in 3 years, she could be herself, completely and authentically herself, while serving her community. The masquerade was over. The real work was about to begin.
The next morning, Natalie walked into Fort Rucker with a fundamentally different sense of purpose than she'd felt during any of her previous visits. For 3 years, these trips had been carefully orchestrated to maintain her cover, volunteer work that allowed her to stay connected to military culture without revealing her background. Now, for the first time since her discharge, she was entering a military installation as herself. Specialist Natalie Quinn, combat veteran and officially designated liaison for Auburn University's most ambitious Military Appreciation Week in history. Hannah Cross was waiting in the lobby of Building 4507, wearing the kind of knowing smile that suggested she'd been expecting this development for months. Well, well, she said as Natalie approached, I hear congratulations are in order. Word travels fast in military circles when a decorated logistics specialist finally decides to stop pretending she's just another college student. How did you... Natalie began, then stopped. Captain Foster. Captain Foster, Hannah confirmed. He may have mentioned to a few people that his former logistics coordinator was about to emerge from deep cover to organize the kind of military appreciation event that Fort Rucker has been hoping for since they started their community outreach program. They walked together toward the conference room where Captain Dylan Foster was waiting with what appeared to be half of Fort Rucker's senior staff. As they entered the room, Natalie was greeted by a sight that simultaneously thrilled and terrified her: a formal military planning session, complete with detailed maps, operational timelines, and the kind of comprehensive coordination charts she hadn't seen since her discharge 3 years earlier. "Specialist Quinn," Captain Foster said, standing as she entered. "Good to have you back in an official capacity." Dylan Foster looked exactly as Natalie remembered him from their deployment days: tall, lean, with the kind of quiet confidence that made junior officers want to follow his leadership and senior officers want to promote him. At 32, he'd already commanded 2 companies and was being groomed for battalion leadership. More importantly, for Natalie's current situation, he understood her capabilities better than anyone else in the room. "Sir," Natalie replied, automatically falling into military bearing despite her civilian clothes. "Thank you for agreeing to support this partnership." "Support it?" Foster laughed. "Quinn, we've been waiting 3 years for you to stop playing college student and get back to doing what you do best. This isn't support, this is celebration." Around the conference table sat Master Sergeant Ryan Cole, who had served as Natalie's direct supervisor during their joint operations deployment; Chief Warrant Officer Lisa Grant, the senior pilot who had flown more missions coordinated by Natalie than anyone else; and Staff Sergeant Tyler Brooks, who had transitioned from gate guard duty to become Foster's operations sergeant. "All right, let's get down to business," Foster announced, activating a projection screen that displayed aerial photographs of Auburn University's campus. "Quinn, what we're proposing here goes beyond typical community outreach. Based on your initial proposal, we're looking at a comprehensive demonstration of military aviation capabilities, educational programming that will reach over 10,000 students, and coordination requirements that would challenge most professional event planning organizations." Natalie studied the campus imagery, her mind automatically shifting into operational planning mode. "What are our primary constraints?" "Logistics, security, and politics," Master Sergeant Cole replied. "Logistics, because we're coordinating aircraft operations in a civilian environment with noise restrictions, airspace limitations, and ground safety requirements. Security, because we're bringing military aircraft and personnel into a high-visibility public setting. Politics, because this partnership represents Auburn University, Fort Rucker, and the broader Army aviation community." Chief Warrant Officer Grant pulled up detailed flight path charts. "The helicopter demonstrations are going to be the most complex element. We're proposing to land 2 Blackhawks on the main quad, which requires coordinating with FAA air traffic control, Auburn's risk management office, and campus security. Plus, we need to ensure adequate safety perimeters for spectators." Natalie examined the flight charts with the kind of detailed attention that impressed even experienced military aviators. "What's our backup plan if weather conditions prevent landing on the quad?" "That's where your expertise becomes crucial," Foster explained. "We need someone who understands both helicopter operations and university logistics to develop contingency plans that maintain the educational impact while adapting to changing conditions." Staff Sergeant Brooks opened a thick folder containing coordination requirements. "The educational programming is equally complex. We're proposing daily presentations in multiple campus venues, equipment displays that require security oversight, and interactive demonstrations that let students experience flight simulation and navigation systems. Student safety protocols."
"That's where you come in," Hannah Cross interjected. "Fort Rucker has excellent safety procedures for military personnel, but adapting those procedures for college students requires someone who understands both environments." For the next 4 hours, Natalie found herself immersed in the kind of detailed operational planning that had defined her military career. They discussed helicopter maintenance schedules, pilot rotation requirements, security coordination with local law enforcement, media relations protocols, and contingency planning for everything from severe weather to equipment failures. Quinn, Foster said during a brief break, I have to ask, how does it feel to be doing this kind of work again? Natalie considered the question carefully. Familiar. Challenging. Like something I should have been doing all along. Any regrets about the 3-year hiatus? No, she replied firmly. I needed that time to figure out who I wanted to be outside the military. But I think I was wrong to assume that meant completely separating myself from military service. Maybe the best way to honor what we learned in uniform is to apply those skills in civilian contexts. Master Sergeant Cole overheard the conversation and joined them. You know, Quinn, some of the junior logistics specialists we've trained over the past few years could learn a lot from watching you coordinate this event. Would you be interested in having them participate as observers? The suggestion caught Natalie off guard. You mean mentor current military personnel? Why not? You've got operational experience they can't get in classroom training, and you understand civilian coordination requirements that most military personnel never encounter. This could be a learning opportunity for everyone involved. As the planning session continued, Natalie realized that her role was evolving beyond simple liaison work. She was becoming the bridge between two worlds, military and civilian, that rarely understood each other despite their mutual respect. Auburn University students would gain insight into military aviation that few civilians ever experienced, while Fort Rucker personnel would learn about public engagement and educational outreach that could benefit their future community relations efforts. There's one more thing we need to discuss, Foster said as the meeting concluded. Media attention. This partnership is going to attract regional news coverage, possibly national attention, if the helicopter demonstrations are as impressive as we're planning. Are you prepared for that level of visibility? Natalie felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. For 3 years, she'd worked to remain invisible, to blend seamlessly into civilian life without drawing attention to her military background. Now she was about to become the public face of a partnership that would showcase exactly the kind of military expertise she'd been hiding. I understand the implications, she replied, but I think it's time for people to see that veterans are successfully transitioning to civilian leadership roles. Maybe this visibility will encourage other veterans to engage with their communities instead of hiding their service. Hannah Cross smiled, spoken like someone who's finally ready to own her story. As Natalie drove back to Auburn that evening, her mind was buzzing with operational details, timeline requirements, and coordination challenges. But underneath the tactical planning, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her discharge: the deep satisfaction of using her skills for something that mattered. For 3 years, she'd convinced herself that hiding her military service was necessary to protect her family and build a civilian identity. Now she realized that hiding had also meant wasting the very skills and experience that could make the greatest difference in her community. Military Appreciation Week was still 3 weeks away, but Natalie already knew that her carefully constructed civilian life was about to change forever. The question was whether Auburn University and her sorority sisters were ready for the transformation that was coming.
Monday morning of Military Appreciation Week arrived with the kind of crisp October weather that made Auburn University's campus look like something from a college brochure. Natalie stood on the steps of the Student Union at 600 hours, wearing dark jeans, a navy blue Auburn University polo shirt, and the kind of confident expression that had been missing from her face for 3 years. In her hands was a military-grade radio that connected her directly to Captain Foster's coordination center at Fort Rucker, and clipped to her belt was the CAC card that she no longer bothered to hide. Overwatch Base, this is Campus Control. She spoke into the radio with the professional clarity of someone who had coordinated far more complex operations under much more dangerous conditions. Auburn University campus is secure and ready for day 1 operations. Copy that, Campus Control, came Captain Foster's voice through the static. First transport departing Fort Rucker at 0630 hours, ETA 0715 for setup and equipment staging. Around the quad, Auburn students were beginning their Monday morning routines.
heading to early classes, grabbing coffee from campus vendors, and generally maintaining the kind of blissful ignorance about military operations that Natalie had once envied. They had no idea that over the next 5 days, their campus would be transformed into something resembling a forward operating base, complete with helicopter landing zones, military equipment displays, and educational programming that would challenge everything they thought they knew about military service. "Natalie," called Emma Sullivan, approaching with a clipboard and the determined expression of someone trying to manage logistics she didn't fully understand. "The university facilities crew is asking about power requirements for the equipment displays. Do you know what the military personnel will need?" Natalie smiled, remembering similar conversations from her deployment days when civilian contractors had tried to understand military power and communications requirements. Two 30-amp circuits for the flight simulator, standard 110-volt outlets for the communications equipment, and backup generator access in case of power outages. I sent the detailed requirements to facilities management last week. "Of course you did," Emma replied, though her expression suggested she was still adjusting to having a sorority sister who spoke fluent military logistics. "Natalie, I have to ask, are you sure we can handle all this? Because I'm looking at the schedule you developed, and it's more complex than anything our chapter has ever attempted." Before Natalie could respond, the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors began echoing across campus. Students stopped walking and looked up to see two UH-60 Blackhawk helicopters approaching from the south, flying in perfect formation at exactly the altitude and trajectory Natalie had calculated during her planning sessions with Chief Warrant Officer Grant. "Right on time," Natalie murmured, checking her watch. "Emma, trust me, we've got this." The helicopters circled campus once, a demonstration flight that had been carefully coordinated with Auburn's air traffic control and the Federal Aviation Administration, before heading to their designated landing zone in the parking area behind the athletics complex. Within minutes, Natalie's radio crackled with confirmation that the aircraft had landed safely and military personnel were beginning equipment unloading procedures. "Campus Control, this is Ground Team Alpha. Equipment staging proceeding on schedule. Request permission to begin transport to display locations." "Permission granted, Ground Team Alpha. Campus security is standing by to assist with route clearance." As she coordinated the movement of military equipment across Auburn's campus, Natalie felt the familiar rhythm of operational execution that had defined her military career. Every detail had been planned, every contingency anticipated, every coordination requirement addressed. The only difference was that instead of managing helicopter support for combat operations, she was managing helicopter demonstrations for educational programming. "Excuse me," called a voice behind her. "Are you the person coordinating this military event?" Natalie turned to find Dr. James Patterson, Auburn's Dean of Student Affairs, approaching with the administrative concern that suggested someone had questioned whether a sorority was qualified to manage such a complex partnership. "Yes, sir," Natalie replied. "I'm Natalie Quinn, Sigma Beta Chi's liaison with Fort Rucker. Is there a problem?" Dr. Patterson studied her with the careful attention of someone trying to reconcile her appearance with her apparent authority. "No problem exactly, but I've been getting calls from other departments asking how a sorority member became qualified to coordinate military aircraft operations on campus. The facilities management office is particularly impressed with the thoroughness of your planning documentation." "I have relevant experience," Natalie replied diplomatically. "What kind of relevant experience prepares a college student to coordinate with Army aviation units?"
Before Natalie could answer, her radio crackled with an urgent transmission. "Campus Control, this is Overwatch Base. We have a developing weather situation. Thunderstorms approaching from the southwest. ETA approximately 1,400 hours. Request contingency plan activation for afternoon programming." Natalie immediately shifted into crisis management mode, her training taking over automatically. "Copy, Overwatch Base, activating contingency plan Delta, moving afternoon outdoor demonstrations to Beard Eves Memorial Coliseum. Ground teams stand by for equipment relocation." She turned to Dr. Patterson, who was watching her manage the developing situation with obvious surprise. "Sir, I need to coordinate some scheduled changes due to incoming weather. Could we continue this conversation later?" "Certainly,"
Dr. Patterson replied, though his expression suggested that he was beginning to understand that Natalie Quinn was considerably more than she appeared to be. Over the next hour, Natalie orchestrated the kind of rapid logistical adaptation that would have impressed professional event coordinators. Working with her radio, her detailed contingency plans, and the military precision of her Fort Rucker partners, she moved equipment displays, relocated personnel, coordinated with campus facilities management, and updated publicity materials to reflect the new schedule. "How did you know to prepare for weather contingencies?" asked Zoe Mitchell, who had been watching Natalie's crisis management with amazement. "Because you always prepare for contingencies. Equipment fails, weather changes, personnel get sick, and vehicles break down. If you don't plan for problems, problems will destroy your mission." "Mission?" Zoe repeated. "Natalie, this is a university event, not a military operation." Natalie paused, realizing that her language had shifted back to military terminology without conscious thought. Force of habit. When you've planned operations where failure means people get hurt, you develop a certain approach to logistics management. By noon, the initial crisis had been resolved, and Military Appreciation Week programming was proceeding smoothly despite the weather complications. Auburn students were touring the equipment displays, attending educational presentations, and experiencing flight simulators that most civilians never encountered. The Fort Rucker personnel were engaged with enthusiastic audiences who were asking thoughtful questions about military aviation, career opportunities, and the realities of military service. "Natalie," said Chloe Lancaster, approaching with an expression that mixed admiration with something approaching awe, "I owe you more than an apology. I owe you recognition that you're operating at a level the rest of us never imagined possible." "It's just logistics coordination," Natalie replied, modestly. "No, it's not," Chloe insisted. "It's military-grade project management applied to civilian programming. It's crisis response capabilities that most professional event planners would envy. And it's leadership under pressure that makes me understand why Captain Foster speaks about you the way he does." "Has Captain Foster been talking about me?" Emma Sullivan interjected, joining their conversation. "Natalie, did you know that you're something of a legend among military logistics specialists? Captain Foster told the university administration that you were one of the most capable coordination specialists he had ever worked with, even before you reached your 20th birthday." Her cheeks felt red. For 3 years, she'd worked to hide her military accomplishments, to blend seamlessly into civilian life without drawing attention to her service record. Now, her former commanding officer was apparently sharing details about her capabilities with anyone who would listen. "What else did Captain Foster tell them?" she asked. Emma smiled. "He told them that Auburn University was lucky to have you and that Fort Rucker was honored to work with someone who represented the best of both military service and civilian leadership." As the first day of Military Appreciation Week concluded successfully despite the weather complications, Natalie realized that her story was no longer something she could control or contain. Word was spreading throughout Auburn's administration, among Fort Rucker personnel, and across the broader community about the sorority girl who had coordinated military partnerships with professional expertise that exceeded most people's expectations. The masquerade was truly over, but instead of the exposure destroying her carefully constructed civilian identity, it seemed to be creating something new. A public recognition that veterans could serve their communities in ways that honor their military experience and their civilian aspirations. The question was whether she was ready for the full implications of that recognition. Thursday afternoon brought the kind of emergency that tests not just planning and preparation, but character under pressure. Natalie was reviewing Friday's ceremony arrangements in the student union when her radio erupted with urgent transmissions that immediately commanded her full attention. "Campus control, this is Overwatch Base. Emergency traffic. came Captain Foster's voice, with the clipped urgency that Natalie recognized from combat communications. "We have a medical emergency in progress. Student injured during helicopter tour. Appears to be serious. Requesting immediate coordination for emergency medical services." Natalie's training kicked in immediately, 3 years of civilian life disappearing as her mind shifted into crisis response mode. Copy, Overwatch Base. Nature of injury and current location. Student fell during aircraft inspection tour, possible head trauma and suspected spinal injury. Patient is conscious but requires immediate medical attention. Location is Landing Zone Alpha behind the athletics complex. Roger. Campus Control is coordinating emergency response now. Without hesitation, Natalie activated the emergency protocols she'd developed but hoped never to use. Her first call went to Auburn University's Emergency Medical Services, her second to Lee Canty Emergency Medical Services, and her third to the campus security office that had been briefed on Military Appreciation Week coordination requirements. "This is Natalie Quinn, Fort Rucker liaison," she said into her phone, while simultaneously coordinating via radio. "We have a medical emergency at the helicopter display area. I need EMS response immediately, and I need campus security to clear traffic routes for ambulance access." Within minutes, Natalie was running across campus toward the helicopter display area, her mind automatically calculating response times, coordination requirements, and the potential implications for both the injured student and the broader Military Appreciation Week programming. As she approached Landing Zone Alpha, she could see a crowd of students gathered around what appeared to be someone lying on the ground next to one of the Blackhawk helicopters. "Clear the area," Natalie called out as she arrived, her voice carrying the unmistakable authority of someone trained to manage emergency situations. "Give the medical personnel room to work." The injured student was Marcus Williams, a sophomore engineering major who'd been participating in the guided helicopter tour when he'd apparently slipped while climbing down from the aircraft's crew compartment. He was conscious but disoriented, with obvious signs of head trauma and complaints of neck pain that suggested possible spinal injury. Chief Warrant Officer Grant was kneeling beside Marcus, applying basic first aid while maintaining spinal immobilization. "Quinn, thank God you're here. We've got the bleeding controlled, but he needs professional medical attention immediately. EMS is en route. Campus security is clearing access routes now. What's his condition?" "Conscious and responsive, but possible concussion and cervical spine injury. We need to maintain immobilization until the EMTs can assess him properly." Natalie knelt beside Marcus, her voice taking on the calm, professional tone she'd used with wounded soldiers in Afghanistan. "Marcus, my name is Natalie. I'm coordinating your medical care. That ambulance is coming and we're going to take excellent care of you. Can you tell me your name and what day it is?" "Marcus Williams." "Thursday. I think it's Thursday. My head really hurts." "That's perfectly normal," Natalie said, maintaining eye contact while mentally cataloging his symptoms. "You took a hard fall, but you're going to be fine. We're keeping your head and neck still until the doctors can check you out, okay?" Within 8 minutes, faster than Natalie's most optimistic estimates, Auburn's emergency medical services arrived, followed quickly by a Lee County ambulance with advanced life support capabilities. As the EMTs took over Marcus's care, Natalie shifted seamlessly from direct patient care to coordination and communication management. "This is Natalie Quinn," she said to the lead EMT. "The patient fell approximately 12 feet from aircraft crew compartment, landed primarily on his back and head. He's been conscious throughout, but showing signs of concussion and possible cervical spine injury. We've maintained immobilization since the incident occurred." The EMT looked at her with surprise. "Are you medical personnel?" "No, but I have combat lifesaver training and experience with trauma management. The military personnel on scene provided initial stabilization." As the ambulance departed with Marcus, Natalie found herself surrounded by Auburn University administrators who had arrived in response to the emergency. Dr. Patterson was there, along with the Dean of Engineering, the Director of Risk Management, and several other officials whose expressions ranged from concern to barely controlled panic. "Miss Quinn," Dr. Patterson began, "we need to discuss the implications of this incident. A student has been seriously injured during a university-sponsored event, and there are going to be investigations, liability assessments, and media attention."
"Understood," Natalie replied. "But first, let me brief you on our response protocols and documentation procedures." Over the next hour, Natalie demonstrated crisis management capabilities that impressed even seasoned university administrators. She provided detailed incident reports, coordinated with Auburn's legal affairs office, managed communications with Fort Rucker's command structure, and developed preliminary recommendations for enhanced safety protocols that would prevent similar incidents while maintaining the educational value of the programming. Ms. Quinn, said Rebecca Torres, Auburn's Director of Risk Management, your response to this emergency has been exemplary. But I have to ask, where did the sorority member learn incident command procedures and trauma response protocols? Before Natalie could answer, Captain Foster arrived from Fort Rucker with Master Sergeant Cole and a small team of military personnel who would assist with the incident investigation. As Foster approached the group of administrators, his bearing and professional demeanor commanded immediate respect. "Ladies and gentlemen," Foster announced, "I want to assure you that Fort Rucker takes this incident extremely seriously. We will conduct a thorough investigation and implement any necessary safety improvements. But I also want you to understand that your incident response was managed by one of the most capable logistics and crisis management specialists I've ever worked with." Dr. Patterson looked confused. "Captain, we appreciate the coordination, but Miss Quinn is a student at Auburn University. She's a member of Sigma Beta Chi sorority." Foster glanced at Natalie, who nodded slightly, permission to share information that she could no longer keep hidden. "Dr. Patterson, Miss Quinn is also former Specialist Natalie Quinn, United States Army, with 2 years of combat deployment experience managing helicopter operations and emergency coordination in Afghanistan. The incident response you just witnessed represents military-grade crisis management applied to civilian emergency situations." The silence that followed was profound. Auburn's administrators stared at Natalie with expressions that mixed shock, understanding, and something approaching awe. For 3 years, they'd interacted with her as just another student. Now they were learning that one of their sorority members was a decorated combat veteran with capabilities that exceeded most professional emergency coordinators. Dr. Patterson said slowly, "Specialist Quinn, I think we need to have a much longer conversation about your background and your role in this partnership." "Yes, sir. But first, I'd like to check on Marcus's condition and ensure that his family has been properly notified." As the immediate crisis management continued, word began spreading across Auburn University's campus about what had really happened during the emergency. Students who had witnessed Natalie's response were sharing stories about the sorority girl who had managed the incident with professional expertise that seemed impossible for someone their age. Social media posts began appearing with descriptions of her calm authority, her medical knowledge, and her seamless coordination with military and civilian emergency personnel. By evening, the story had evolved beyond a simple medical emergency. It had become the revelation of Auburn University's hidden combat veteran, the sorority member who had been hiding in plain sight while possessing capabilities that most people couldn't imagine. Marcus Williams was stable at East Alabama Medical Center with a concussion and minor cervical strain, injuries that could have been much worse without proper initial response. The incident investigation would eventually confirm that his fall was accidental and that all safety protocols had been properly followed. But for Natalie, the emergency had accomplished something that 3 years of careful cover had been designed to prevent. It had revealed her true identity to the entire Auburn University community in the most public way possible. There was no going back to anonymity now. The question was whether she was ready to embrace the full implications of being recognized as both a student and a veteran, both a sorority member and a former soldier, both a young woman and a crisis management professional whose capabilities exceeded those of people twice her age.
Friday morning dawned clear and crisp,
perfect weather for the culminating ceremony of Military Appreciation Week. But as Natalie walked across Auburn's campus at 0060 hours to begin final preparations, she knew that this day would be about much more than honoring military service. Word of Thursday's emergency response had spread throughout the university community, and she could feel the weight of attention and expectation that came with her newly revealed identity. Her phone had been buzzing since dawn with messages from reporters, university officials, and military personnel who had learned about the sorority girl combat veteran who had managed a medical emergency with professional expertise that had impressed seasoned first responders. The story had spread beyond Auburn's campus to regional media outlets, and several national news organizations were reportedly sending crews to cover the closing ceremony. "Natalie," called Emma Sullivan, approaching with the kind of nervous energy that suggested she was still processing the revelations of the past 24 hours. "Channel 13 News wants to interview you before the ceremony, and the Montgomery Advertiser is asking for background information about your military service. How do you want to handle the media attention?" Natalie paused her radio check with Fort Rucker's Coordination Center. For 3 years, she'd worked to avoid exactly this kind of public scrutiny. Now it was unavoidable, and she found herself surprisingly calm about the prospect of finally telling her complete story. "Schedule the interviews for after the ceremony," she replied. "Today should be about honoring military service, not about my personal background. But Emma, I want you to know that I'm ready to be completely transparent about who I am and why I've been hiding it." As the morning progressed, Auburn's quad filled with students, faculty, community members, and military personnel from Fort Rucker. The helicopter displays had drawn crowds throughout the week, but Friday's ceremony promised something special, a formal recognition of military service that would feature presentations by active duty personnel, veterans from multiple conflicts, and educational programming that had exceeded everyone's expectations. At 10 a.m., as Natalie was coordinating final sound system checks and reviewing the ceremony program with Captain Foster, she noticed an unexpected addition to the gathering crowd. A small group of older men wearing military dress uniforms and displaying ribbons that indicated extensive combat experience were approaching the main stage area. "Quinn," Captain Foster said, following her gaze, "I should probably mention that word of this week's programming has reached some interesting places. Those gentlemen represent the veterans of foreign wars and the American Legion. They've driven from Montgomery specifically to attend today's ceremony." "Why?" asked Natalie, though she suspected the answer. "Because they've heard about a young combat veteran who's been organizing military appreciation events that actually honor the reality of military service instead of offering symbolic gestures. They want to meet you." Before Natalie could respond, her radio crackled with a transmission that commanded immediate attention. "Campus Control, this is Overwatch Base. We have VIP inbound, ETA 10 minutes. Please confirm landing zone status for official delegation." "Copy, Overwatch Base. Landing zone is clear and secure. VIP delegation cleared for approach." Foster smiled. "Quinn, there's something else I didn't mention. Auburn's Military Appreciation Week has attracted attention from Fort Rucker's commanding general. General Patricia Stone is flying in personally to participate in today's ceremony." Natalie felt her pulse quicken. General Stone was a legend in Army aviation circles, the first woman to command Fort Rucker and a combat veteran whose leadership had transformed military aviation training. She was also someone whose reputation for excellence meant that her personal attendance at Auburn's ceremony represented unprecedented recognition for the week's programming. "Sir, why is General Stone coming here?" "Because, Quinn, what you've accomplished this week represents exactly the kind of community partnership that Fort Rucker has been trying to develop for years. You've created programming that educates civilians about military service while honoring the complexity and professionalism of military aviation. You've coordinated emergency response that probably saved a student's life, and you've done it all while maintaining the kind of operational excellence that makes military personnel proud to be associated with Auburn University." At 11 a.m., the ceremony began with a precision that reflected Natalie's careful planning and the professional standards of her Fort Rucker partners. Auburn's ROTC Honor Guard presented colors, while 2 Blackhawk helicopters performed a ceremonial flyover that drew cheers from the assembled crowd of over 2,000 students and community members.
"Ladies and gentlemen," announced Dr. Patterson, serving as Master of Ceremonies,
This week's Military Appreciation Week programming has been extraordinary in its scope, professionalism, and educational impact. But before we continue with today's ceremony, I want to recognize the person whose vision and expertise made this partnership possible. Natalie felt her stomach drop as Dr. Patterson gestured for her to join him on the main stage. She'd expected to remain behind the scenes, coordinating logistics while others received public recognition. Instead, she found herself walking toward a microphone in front of thousands of people who were about to learn the truth about who she really was. This week's programming was coordinated by Ms. Natalie Quinn, a senior at Auburn University and a member of Sigma Beta Chi Sorority, Dr. Patterson continued. But Ms. Quinn brought unique qualifications to this partnership. She is also former Specialist Natalie Quinn, United States Army, a combat veteran with 2 deployments to Afghanistan and specialized expertise in helicopter operations coordination. The crowd's reaction was immediate and powerful. Students who had attended her sorority's events cheered with surprise and pride. Military personnel and veterans in the audience rendered sharp salutes. Community members applauded with the kind of genuine appreciation that comes from understanding the sacrifice and service that military deployment represents. "Specialist Quinn," Dr. Patterson said, offering her the microphone, "would you like to share your thoughts about this week's programming and what military appreciation means to you?" Natalie looked out at the crowd, seeing faces that ranged from curious to admiring to genuinely moved. For 3 years, she'd hidden from this kind of public recognition, terrified that revealing her military service would somehow diminish her civilian accomplishments or inspire others to make dangerous choices about military careers. Now, standing on a stage in front of her entire university community, she realized that hiding had been the real mistake. "Thank you," she began, her voice carrying clearly across the quad. "When I first proposed this partnership with Fort Rucker, my sorority sisters thought I was naive and overly ambitious. They couldn't understand how a college student could coordinate with military aviation units or manage the complexity of helicopter demonstrations on campus." She paused, looking toward where Emma, Chloe, and her other sorority sisters were standing, with expressions of pride and amazement. What they didn't know was that I've been hiding my military service for 3 years, trying to build a civilian identity that was completely separate from my experience as a combat veteran. I thought I had to choose between being a former soldier and being a normal college student. The crowd was completely silent now, hanging on every word. This week's programming has taught me that I was wrong. The best way to honor military service isn't to hide from it or treat it as something separate from civilian life. The best way to honor military service is to apply the skills, values, and dedication we learned in uniform to make our civilian communities better. As Natalie continued speaking, she noticed movement at the edge of the crowd. General Stone had arrived and was making her way toward the stage, her presence commanding immediate attention from military personnel and civilians alike. Military appreciation isn't about thanking veterans for their service and then forgetting about them. It's about recognizing that veterans are your neighbors, your classmates, your sorority sisters, and your community leaders. It's about understanding that the transition from military to civilian life doesn't mean abandoning everything we learned in uniform. It means finding new ways to serve. The applause that followed was sustained and genuine, the kind of recognition that comes from people who have been moved by truth rather than rhetoric.
General Patricia Stone stepped onto the stage with the kind of commanding presence that made both military personnel and civilians automatically straighten their posture. At 52, she had earned her stars through a combination of exceptional leadership, combat experience, and the kind of professional excellence that had broken barriers for women in military aviation. Her decision to personally attend Auburn's Military Appreciation Week ceremony represented recognition that went far beyond routine community relations. "Ladies and gentlemen," General Stone began, her voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to addressing large formations. "I've commanded Fort Rucker for 3 years, and in that time I've seen many attempts at military-civilian partnerships. Most of them are well-intentioned, but superficial. Events that thank us for our service, without truly understanding what that service means. She paused, looking directly at Natalie. This week has been different. This week, Auburn University has experienced military appreciation programming that reflects genuine understanding of military professionalism, meaningful educational content, and coordination that meets the highest standards of both civilian and military excellence. The crowd listened in rapt attention as General Stone continued. The person responsible for this programming is former specialist Natalie Quinn, who served with distinction in Afghanistan and who has demonstrated that the transition from military to civilian life doesn't mean abandoning the values and capabilities that made her an exceptional soldier. General Stone gestured toward Captain Foster, who approached the stage carrying what appeared to be an official military document. Specialist Quinn, by the authority vested in me as Commanding General of Fort Rucker, and in recognition of your exceptional service to both military and civilian communities, I hereby present you with the Fort Rucker Community Partnership Award, the first such recognition ever given to a college student. As Natalie accepted the award, a beautifully engraved plaque that would later hang in Auburn's ROTC building, she felt emotions she hadn't experienced since her military discharge. For 3 years, she'd convinced herself that her service was something to hide from, something that belonged to a different version of herself. Now, she was being honored for applying that service to civilian leadership. But there's something else we need to address. She activated a small radio device and spoke clearly. Flight lead, this is Stone Actual. Execute recognition protocol. The sound that followed was unmistakable, the deep, rhythmic thunder of helicopter rotors approaching from multiple directions. Students and community members looked up to see something unprecedented in Auburn University's history. A formation of 4 UH-60 Blackhawk helicopters approaching the campus in perfect tactical formation. Throughout this week, General Stone announced over the growing sound of the aircraft, Specialist Quinn has coordinated with military precision, managed crises with professional expertise, and demonstrated leadership that would be impressive in any context. But what makes her truly exceptional is that she's done all of this while maintaining her cover as just a sorority girl. The helicopters passed overhead in a ceremonial flyover, then banked sharply and approached the main quad for what appeared to be an actual landing. Students and faculty moved back as the aircraft settled onto the grass with the kind of precision that indicated this had been carefully planned and expertly executed. Those aircraft, General Stone explained as the rotors wound down, are crewed by some of the finest pilots and aircrew in Army aviation. Many of them have worked with Specialist Quinn during her military service. They've flown the missions she coordinated, relied on her expertise for successful operations, and witnessed her capabilities under the most challenging conditions imaginable. The helicopter crews began shutting down their aircraft and exiting in formation. As they approached the stage area, Natalie could see familiar faces, pilots and crew chiefs she had worked with during her deployments, professionals who had trusted her with their missions and their lives. Chief Warrant Officer Grant led the formation, followed by pilots and aircrew from multiple units who had served alongside Natalie in Afghanistan. Behind them came crew chiefs, flight engineers, and medics who had participated in operations that Natalie had coordinated from forward operating bases thousands of miles from Auburn's peaceful campus. Specialist Quinn, General Stone announced, these aviation professionals have traveled here today to render recognition that the Army rarely gives in civilian settings. Chief Warrant Officer Grant stepped forward and called the formation to attention. Unit, attention. Present arms. What happened next was unprecedented in Auburn University's history. 12 of the Army's finest aviators and aircrew rendered the sharpest military salutes that had ever been seen on Auburn's campus, holding the position with the kind of precision that demonstrated profound respect and professional recognition. The salute was held for a full 30 seconds, long enough for every person in the crowd to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Students who had never seen a military formation stared in amazement. Faculty members who had spent decades in academic settings found themselves moved by the display of military honor. Community members who had attended the ceremony expecting routine military appreciation programming realized they were witnessing the public recognition of someone whose service and capabilities exceeded anything they had imagined possible. "Order arms!" Chief Warrant Officer Grant commanded, and the formation returned to attention with synchronized precision. General Stone stepped forward. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you have just witnessed is the recognition of professional excellence by professional peers. These aviation personnel have rendered honors to Specialist Quinn not because of her civilian accomplishments, but because of her military service and the impact that service had on their missions and their lives." Chief Warrant Officer Grant approached the microphone. 3 years ago, Specialist Quinn was coordinating helicopter operations that saved lives in completed missions under combat conditions. Her expertise, dedication, and leadership contributed to the success of operations that most civilians will never know about and should never have to worry about. She paused, looking directly at Natalie. "Today, we learned that she's been attending college and serving her community while keeping that background hidden. We came here to remind her, and to remind all of you, that military service is something to be proud of, not something to hide from." The applause that followed was sustained and powerful, but it was different from typical ceremonial recognition. This was the sound of a community that had just learned something important about the veterans who live among them, study alongside them, and contribute to their communities in ways that often go unrecognized. As the ceremony concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Natalie found herself surrounded by her sorority sisters, university officials, community members, and military personnel who wanted to express their appreciation for what she had accomplished. "Natalie," said Emma Sullivan, her voice thick with emotion, "I keep thinking about all the times we treated you like you were just another college student, all the times we questioned your capabilities or underestimated what you could accomplish. You weren't wrong to do that. I wanted you to see me as just another college student. I was hiding from who I really was because I thought my military service was something I needed to leave behind." Chloe Lancaster, who had opposed Natalie's initial proposal with such vehemence, approached with tears in her eyes. "Natalie, I owe you an apology that goes way beyond sorority politics. I questioned your qualifications when I should have been questioning my own assumptions about what veterans look like and what they're capable of." "Chloe, you don't." "Yes, I do," Chloe interrupted. "You've taught all of us something important about not judging people based on appearances or assumptions. You've shown us that veterans are our classmates, our friends, our sorority sisters, and that they deserve recognition for their service, not just from the community, but from themselves." As the helicopters prepared to depart Auburn's campus, their crews approached Natalie one final time. These were the pilots and aircrew who had worked with her during some of the most dangerous and important missions of their military career. "Quinn, you know we've always been proud to have worked with you, but today, seeing what you've accomplished here, seeing how you've used your military skills to serve your civilian community, we're even prouder to call you a fellow soldier." The helicopters lifted off from Auburn's quad in formation, disappearing into the Alabama sky with the kind of precision and professionalism that had characterized the entire week's programming. But the impact of their visit and their unprecedented salute to a sorority girl who was so much more than she appeared would resonate throughout Auburn University for years to come. Natalie Quinn was no longer hiding. She was no longer pretending to be someone she wasn't. She was finally, completely, authentically herself. A combat veteran, a college student, a sorority member,
a community leader, and proof that the best way to honor military service is to apply it to making civilian communities better. The girl who had been just a sorority girl until Blackhawk pilots saluted her in the quad had become something much more important. An example of what happens when veterans stop hiding from their service and start embracing it as a foundation for civilian leadership. Her story was no longer about choosing between military and civilian identities. It was about integrating them into something powerful, authentic, and inspiring. Exactly what the country needs from its veterans and exactly what veterans need from themselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.